Welcome to the Lorecast. I'm Dr. Craig Chalkwist, and we're looking at the stories by which we deeply live. I've been thinking recently about how story, imagination, play, pleasure, and joy can all be forms of resistance to injustice. And I remember reading that during the Civil War in El Salvador, there were women who set up committees of joy in some of the camps out in the field. Joy was a priority, strengthened the soul. And I'm also remembering a remarkable piece that James Hillman wrote called City and Soul. It's one of the essays in his standard edition. I still can't get over how James Hillman's collected works are called the standard edition. There was nothing standard about Hillman. Anyway, in City and Soul, he says, I do believe that were the public to awaken to its hunger for beauty, there would be rebellion in the streets. Was it not aesthetics that took down the Berlin Wall and opened China? Not market consumerism and Western gadgets, as we are told, but music, color, fashion, shoes, fabrics, film, dance, lyrics, and the shapes of cars. The aesthetic response leads to political action, becomes political action, is political action. Something we're thinking about for our time as authoritarian movements gain strength all over the world. There's many reasons for that, for those movements, of course, but the image that always comes to my mind is all the men, because this is mainly driven by men, although women participate, all the men and some women who want a strong daddy. When I did men's groups years ago for men who had been arrested for violence, I was really struck by how consistently the ones who had an authoritarian mindset were also the ones that didn't really have fathers. Their fathers were absent somehow, oftentimes in jail or prison. Their fathers were drunk or violent, so they're looking for dad somewhere else. In any case, in terms of resisting injustice, I wanted to make a couple of points in this podcast. One is that story, imagination, aesthetics, they aren't magic pills that make things change immediately. That would be a heroic fantasy. We just send the right poems to the right dictators or the right followers, everything will magically change. No, it won't. And the arts are some of the first areas of human endeavor that dictators go after. In this country, the United States, it certainly doesn't help that the humanities have received so little funding over the years, with occasional exceptions. But I do think that there's a strong place for story, imagination, pleasure, play in how we resist oppression, how we fight injustice, how we strive for a better world. So Hillman mentions one example, the awakening of feeling and the senses. And my mythological read on what Hillman said in City and Soul is that Aphrodite took down the Berlin Wall, if we expressed it archetypally. There's her, there's the Graces, the Muses, similar beings in many different folklores, mythologies. Exactly the opposite presences that most activists would cultivate. They're more in the camp of Mars or Athena, strategic Athena, and of course that work needs to be done. But we need a larger scope in our thinking and imagining resistance. And we also need to recognize the limitations of the heroic psychology of activism itself, which often leads to injury, burnout, discouragement of people who don't feel called to do direct activism, which is why I coined the word enchantivism a while back. for people who make a difference in the world, who make things better, even though they're not activists. Enchantivism doesn't replace activism, but it can supplement it. It can be a different response to how things are. In terms of the old stories, they can also tell us that we've been here before. We've been in situations before where the giants or the giant demons, the archons, the asuras, and all the rest overpower civilization. In an old Chinese story, Gong Gong the monster, a gigantic monster, is so dangerous that he actually knocks down a sacred mountain and the whole sky falls down. After which the wisdom goddess Nuwa uses alchemy to put the sky back up. I think there's a hint there for those of us who want to work some creativity in how we respond to things that aren't right. If we think of storytelling as literature, we have only to think about the enormous effect that the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin had on the Union war effort during the American Civil War. Black Beauty did its share for animal rights, and there's many other examples too. My second dissertation, in part, was on how fiction changes reality and can even be a more effective lever than facts and figures. So music, poetry, imagination, play, all the things that I mentioned before can and do strengthen the spirit of people who resist. But what about when they're confronted directly with injustice? What about the fact that in a recent national election, most of the United States by population voted to bring Donald Trump back into office? What can all of our visionary material, our stories, and all the rest of it do about that? It's a good question. For one thing, of course, the arts in particular, but I think all creative activity can make statements that are clearer than straight up facts. Picasso's Guernica was an incredible, powerful, and moving statement against war. But I think we can even go deeper down this road in terms of imagining better futures, imagining different realities to live in. The people who buy into authoritarianism are operating inside of very small guiding stories. They're constricted by fear, waiting for dad to help them. And of course, dad won't. What can help them and what can be powerful is when they notice that people with larger stories live differently. And here I think Aphrodite comes in again, and her son Eros, her seductive belt called Cestus, her chariot driven by doves. We can try all we want to push people out of their limited worldviews, and all they'll do is push back, even harder sometimes. But what about seducing them with better visions of how things could be? With what real community looks like? Real liberation of mind and heart. Sometimes allurement is actually a more effective changer of oppressive behaviors into something more benign than force. Which reminds me of a study out of Harvard done by some social scientists. They looked at decades worth of protests around the world, and by their numbers, the nonviolent ones were twice as effective as the violent ones. If we want to showcase what acceptance and inclusivity look like, and thereby touch the part of authoritarians that has a permanent unconscious sense of not belonging anywhere, we have to really live those values to the point where they're visible. In my fiction, I've given the name Tyranny to the good society waiting for us in the future. Not utopia, but a society of psychologically intelligent, emotionally aware, conscious human beings. A society where everybody has worth. We actually took some steps toward that kind of society now. It would really be an impressive example of how things could be. Not impossible to argue with, but hard to argue with. To frame it in terms of the old tales, we might call this fighting sorcery, which is about the acquisition of power with enchantment. Now, Aphrodite usually goes about with Mars. He shows up at some point, or Ares to be more accurate in terms of Greek mythology. Mars is the Roman form. So where is the place in all this for aggression? There needs to be one. Sometimes it's a matter of taking direct action. As Arjuna found out in the Bhagavad Gita, when upon surveying the battlefield, Krishna, his charioteer, said, "It's your duty to fight." So that's there too. And of course, there are many ways to fight. But I think there's a tendency, particularly on the left, politically, among progressives, to avoid anything that has to do with conflict, aggression, strife. It's this almost phobic reaction against it. And I think that can be quite debilitating. Some years ago, I got an email from a group of people who were healers, educators, therapists, spiritual counselors. And they wanted to do two things, and they wished to recruit me in this effort. The first was to send a letter to George W. Bush to explain to him why being reflective was so important and how it would benefit him to be more reflective. I don't know if they ever sent the letter. And the second thing they wanted to do was direct positive energy at him to raise his vibration. And I emailed back and said, "Why aren't you sending energy to his political opponents so they can unseat him?" And I was promptly dropped from the email list. Sorry, folks, but there's a time when you just have to fight back, or you'll lose everything. And the fighting doesn't necessarily have to be violent, but it has to be in a warrior spirit. It has to have guts and a spine. It has to be courageous. Remember, Tillich thought that courage was more than just an asset or a capability, but it was actually foundational for other virtues. Sometimes I think we act toward oppression a bit like innocent Osiris, who kept falling for his brother Seth's traps over and over again. How many times do you have to get killed by somebody to realize that they have it in for you? I think he was in a lot of denial. Can you imagine laying down in a coffin that your evil brother made for you on the excuse of, "I just need to know how large to make these"? Of course, he got sealed up and thrown away, and then later he got dismembered. Osiris ended up in the underworld. I like to think that by that time, he wasn't innocent anymore. And I'm pretty sure I'm right about that, because he was involved in judging the dead, which takes discernment. Takes night vision. I think he had acquired it through his experiences. Maybe we should acquire it too. Maybe we should be like Inanna, who, after being sacrificed on a hook by her aggressive sister, also learned her aggressive sister's death stare so she could use it when she needed it. There's a form of aggression that we tend not to make use of unless we're trying to irritate one another, passive aggression. And the old stories, some of them suggest that this could actually be an effective tactic for resisting injustice. James C. Scott wrote an interesting book on this called Weapons of the Weak. And it's about how rumor mongering, foot dragging, mistake making, and other forms of passive aggression have ended wars, have stopped dictators. It's an interesting idea. It reminds me of an African folktale about the origin of stories. I forget which nation in Africa this comes from, which culture, but at a critical moment, the character Sheep accidentally butts up against the door of the storage hut where all the stories are locked up, and they all flood out all over the world. And there can be in this mixture a bit of trickery, a bit of trickster. In the Greek pantheon, one of the lovers of Aphrodite was Hermes. And there's a story in which he defeats the Argus, the monster with many eyes, the perfect surveillance device. A being which even the hero gods were afraid to fight with, by doing something tricky. He stood right in front of it. And he said, "You mind if I sit down and play some music?" He pulled out the harp that he had won through trickery and a bargain with Apollo. And he started to play these slow, sleepy songs. And one by one, the eyes of the Argus closed. And when the thing was asleep, Hermes quickly pulled out a sword and cut its head off. End of Argus. So trickster tales, and also folk tales and fairy tales that talk about the underdog winning through cleverness. The mother of Athena, her name was Metis, which can mean underdog cleverness. Maybe we should consult with Metis in some of these situations. She's hidden because she was swallowed by authoritarian Zeus, but I have a feeling that she's still very active. And so, all of these non-heroic guards, Aphrodite, Eros, the Muses, Hermes, Metis, and some of the others, maybe with a dash of Mars, I think they give us a lot of tools for dealing with difficulties that are imposed upon us by people who don't mean us well. And don't mean our loved ones well either. There's a fragment of information about a group of people on Samos around the years 524 to 522 BCE who fought against a tyrant, Polycrates. And they fought with stories. They were called Mythietai. And they're described as fractious men. In other words, troublemakers. And I'm pretty sure they weren't all men. Maybe we need a new team of Mythietai. Maybe we need a resistance group that are storytellers and joy givers and enchantvists and tricksters. We could mix in some consciousness studies folk, some depth psych folk. Be interesting to see what they could come up with their creativity in terms of strategies and tactics for facing difficult times. I've mentioned a wisdom academy I'd like to put together outside of higher ed in a video or two past. I have a feeling that these troublemakers are going to have to be part of that effort. The new Mythietai. Thank you.